A London photo with her loving father. A closer look reveals a missing girl's poster face, her own from childhood. Her entire life, a carefully crafted lie. Her father her hero, or her kidnapper. The truth will shatter everything. The biting November air of London whipped strands of Olivia Carter's dark hair across her face as she tried to capture the perfect tourist shot. Big Ben loomed majestically, its iconic clock face a stoic witness to the bustling city below. Her father, George, stood beside her, a proud, slightly sheepish smile on his face as Olivia angled her phone. He'd always been a willing participant in her photo sprees, a comforting constant in her 22 years of life. This trip, a celebration of her upcoming graduation in psychology, was meant to be a cherished memory, a father-daughter bonding experience before she officially stepped into the adult world. "Just a little to the left, Dad," Olivia instructed, her breath misting in the cold. "Perfect." She snapped the picture, then immediately tapped the gallery icon, eager to see the result. George, ever patient, chuckled, pulling his scarf tighter. "As long as I don't look like I've just seen a ghost, I'm happy." As Olivia zoomed in to check the focus, her finger inadvertently swiped, revealing the previous photo she'd taken just moments before, a candid shot of a vibrant red double-decker bus passing a rather cluttered information board near the Westminster tube station. She'd almost deleted it, deeming it uninteresting, but something made her pause. Her eyes, trained by years of psychology lectures to notice minute details, were drawn to a weathered poster tacked haphazardly amongst advertisements for musicals and guided tours. It was a missing person appeal, the kind that always sent a shiver down her spine. The words, "Still Missing," were printed in stark, bold letters above a faded, pixelated image of a young girl. The child, no older than 4 or 5, had wide, innocent eyes and a cascade of dark curls, so similar to Olivia's own childhood photos that a strange sense of unease began to prickle at the back of her neck. Below the image, the name Sarah Wells and the date, missing since July 2005, were clearly visible. Olivia's heart gave an odd little jump. July 2005. She would have been around that age. She quickly did the math. If Sarah Wells was, say, 4 in 2005, she'd be Olivia's contemporary now. A coincidence, surely. London was a massive city. Missing person posters, though tragic, were not uncommon. She tried to dismiss the unsettling feeling, telling herself it was just the somber nature of the poster affecting her. But her gaze kept drifting back to the small, smiling face. There was an undeniable familiarity, a ghostly echo of her own features in the set of the jaw, the curve of the lips, the almost identical scattering of faint freckles across the nose. Freckles she still had, though they faded in the winter months. She quickly swiped back to the photo of her and George, her smile now feeling forced, her earlier light-heartedness evaporating. She glanced at George, who was now engrossed in a tourist map, his brow furrowed in concentration. The man who had raised her, loved her, the only parent she had ever known since her mother, according to him, had died when she was just a baby. He couldn't, the thought was too monstrous to even fully form. Olivia's fingers trembled as she zoomed in again on the poster in the photo. Sarah Wells. The name meant nothing to her. Yet, the face, it was like looking at a miniature, slightly distorted reflection of herself. She had albums filled with pictures from her early childhood, birthday parties, trips to the local park, her first day of school. She'd always thought her resemblance to George was minimal, attributing most of her features to the mother she never knew. George had always been vague about her mother, his voice tinged with a sadness Olivia never dared to probe too deeply. He'd said her name was Eleanor, that she was beautiful, and that she'd succumbed to a sudden illness. There were no photographs of Eleanor, George claiming they were too painful to keep. Olivia had accepted this, her young mind attributing his reluctance to profound grief. Now, a chilling question began to snake its way into her consciousness. Was the absence of her mother's photos not due to grief, but to something far more sinister? Her breath hitched. She felt a sudden, inexplicable urge to run, to confront George, to demand answers to questions she hadn't even known existed minutes ago. But a wave of nausea and dizziness washed over her. The bustling sounds of London, the distant sirens, the chatter of tourists, the rumble of traffic, seemed to fade into a dull roar. The image of the girl, Sarah, was seared into her mind. "Everything all right, Liv?" George's voice, usually a source of comfort, now sounded jarring, almost alien. He had folded the map and was looking at her, a slight concern etching his features. "You look a bit pale. Is the cold getting to you?" Olivia swallowed hard, trying to compose herself, to push down the panic that was clawing its way up her throat. She couldn't let him see. Not yet. She needed to think, to understand what this could possibly mean. "Yeah, Dad," she managed, her voice a little shakier than she intended. Just a bit overwhelmed by it all. It's beautiful here." She forced another smile, hoping it didn't look as grotesque as it felt. She quickly put her phone away, the image of Sarah Wells burning a hole in her digital gallery in her mind. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. Olivia went through the motions, nodding, smiling, posing for more pictures, but her mind was a whirlwind of confusion, fear, and a terrifying, dawning suspicion. Every glance at George was now tainted with this new, horrifying possibility. The man she loved, the man who had been her rock, her entire world. Could he be a stranger, a kidnapper? The thought was a physical blow, making it hard to breathe. That evening, back in their quiet hotel room, Olivia waited until George was asleep, his gentle snores filling the silence. Then, with trembling hands, she retrieved her phone. She stared at the poster again, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. Sarah Wells, missing since 2005, a little girl with her face. She had to know more. The casual tourist photo, a random snapshot of a London street, had just shattered the foundations of her entire existence, raising a question so profound it threatened to unravel everything she believed to be true about herself, her father, and her life. Who was Sarah Wells? And more terrifyingly, who was Olivia Carter? Olivia Carter had always considered herself a grounded individual, pragmatic despite her chosen field of psychology, which often delved into the nebulous realms of human emotion and cognition. She was observant, analytical, and possessed a quiet determination that had seen her through the challenges of her studies. Her relationship with George was the bedrock of her life. He was her anchor, a man of simple routines and unwavering affection. He taught her how to ride a bike, patiently helped with her math homework, and listened with genuine interest to her youthful aspirations. Their life in a quiet suburban town in upstate New York had been, by all accounts, ordinary and loving. The absence of a mother figure had been a fact of life, a sad but accepted part of her personal history, like a missing piece in a puzzle she'd learned to live without. But the image of Sarah Wells had not just introduced a new piece, it had violently scattered the entire puzzle, leaving Olivia adrift in a sea of terrifying uncertainty. The Olivia who had boarded the plane to London, excited and full of anticipation, felt like a distant memory, replaced by a trembling, suspicious version of herself she barely recognized. What was lost wasn't just a photograph of a missing girl. It was the unshakable certainty of her own identity, the innocent trust she'd placed in her father, and the very narrative of her existence. The night after the discovery was torturous. Sleep offered no escape, only a parade of disjointed images. Sarah Wells' smiling face morphing into her own, George's familiar features contorting into something unreadable, a shadowy, indistinct woman. Eleanor? Beckoning from a distance, she lay still, feigning sleep, listening to George's rhythmic breathing from the adjacent bed, each soft snore a potential deception. Was this the sound of a loving father, or the untroubled slumber of a man harboring a secret so profound it had shaped her entire life? The following morning, Olivia's carefully constructed composure was already fraying. She found herself scrutinizing George's every word, every gesture. When he smiled at her over breakfast at a quaint little cafe, his eyes crinkling at the corners as they always did, she felt a pang of guilt for her suspicions, immediately followed by a fresh wave of anxiety. Was this warmth genuine, or a meticulously maintained facade? The psychology student in her recognized the paranoia, but the terrified young woman couldn't silence the screaming questions. "You're awfully quiet this morning, Liv," George commented, dabbing his lips with a napkin. "Didn't sleep well? These old hotel beds can be a bit lumpy." Olivia forced a thin smile. "Just a bit tired, Dad. Jet lag, I guess." It was a weak excuse. They'd been in London for 3 days. She saw a flicker of concern in his eyes, or perhaps it was her own fear reflected back at her. Throughout the day, as they visited the Tower of London and later strolled through Hyde Park, The image of Sarah Wells was a constant, unwelcome companion. Every child they passed with dark hair and bright eyes sent a jolt through her. She tried to subtly bring up the past, hoping to glean some overlooked detail, some inconsistency in George's well-worn stories. "Dad," she began as they sat on a bench watching swans glide across the Serpentine, "do you ever think about Mom, about Eleanor?" George looked out over the water, his expression softening into a familiar melancholy. "Every day, sweetheart? Every single day?" He paused, then turned to her, his gaze gentle. "You have her eyes, you know, and her spirit, strong, a little bit stubborn." He chuckled, a warm, familiar sound that now seemed to mock her. His answers were always the same, heartfelt and consistent. If he was lying, he was an extraordinarily accomplished actor. The details about Eleanor were sparse. She was a kind soul, loved books, and had a laugh that could fill a room. They had met, fallen in love quickly, and then she was gone too soon. No mention of Eleanor's family, no old friends, no specific anecdotes that Olivia could latch onto. It had always been just Eleanor. The "what has been lost" was becoming agonizingly clear. It was her past, her lineage, her very sense of self. If she wasn't Olivia Carter, daughter of George and the late Eleanor, then who was she? Was Sarah Wells her real name? Did she have other parents, a family that had been searching for her for 17 long years? The weight of these questions was crushing. Later that afternoon, while George was engrossed in a historical display at a museum, Olivia slipped away, her heart pounding. She found a quiet alcove and pulled out her phone, her fingers flying across the screen. She typed Sarah Wells Missing London 2005 into the search bar. The results were immediate and chilling. Multiple news articles, albeit dated, appeared. There were appeals from the Metropolitan Police, quotes from distraught parents, a Mark and Susan Wells, and grainy photographs of search parties. One article featured a progression photo, an artist's rendering of what Sarah might look like as a teenager. The resemblance to Olivia's adolescent photos was less striking than the childhood image, but there were still undeniable similarities in the bone structure, the shape of the eyes. Her breath caught in her throat. Mark and Susan Wells, her potential parents. Their grief, articulated in a quote from a 2006 article, felt like a physical blow. "Every day is a nightmare. We just want our little girl home. We'll never stop looking." Olivia felt a wave of profound, disorienting sorrow, not just for herself, but for these strangers who might be her blood. The life she had lived, the love she had received from George, suddenly felt like a stolen existence. Had her happiness been built upon the foundation of their unimaginable pain? She quickly closed the browser, her mind reeling. She couldn't look at George, not now. The museum artifacts, the centuries of history surrounding her, seemed to mock her own fractured timeline. Her personal history, she was beginning to realize, might be a carefully constructed lie. The cheerful, studious Olivia was gone. In her place was a young woman haunted by a face on a poster, and the dawning, terrifying realization that her entire life might be a deception. The bond with her father, once the most solid thing in her world, now felt fragile, terrifyingly so. She was losing her grip on who she was, and the descent into the unknown was just beginning. The trip to London, meant to be a joyful rite of passage, had become a catalyst for a revelation that threatened to destroy everything she held dear. The biggest loss of all, she feared, was the truth, and she was no longer sure she was strong enough to find it or to face what it might reveal about the man she called Dad. The weight of her discovery pressed down on Olivia, a physical ache in her chest that made each breath a conscious effort. 3 days had passed since the moment the still missing poster had shattered her reality. 3 days of feigned normalcy, of sharing meals and sightseeing with George, while inwardly she was a maelstrom of fear and suspicion. The online articles about Sarah Wells, Mark, and Susan Wells were burned into her memory. The desire to act, to do something, warred constantly with the terrifying implications of what that action might unleash. If George, her father, was implicated, the thought was a chasm she couldn't bear to look into. Yet, the faces of Mark and Susan Wells, etched with years of grief in the newspaper clippings, haunted her. If she was their Sarah, then every moment she remained silent was a moment she was denying them, denying herself, the truth. The system, the police, the authorities, they were supposed to help in situations like this. weren't they? On their 5th day in London, under the guise of wanting to explore some independent bookstores, Olivia managed to get a few hours to herself. George, blessedly oblivious, had readily agreed, happy to spend the afternoon at the Imperial War Museum, a place Olivia had feigned disinterest in. Her first stop was not a bookstore, but a nondescript internet cafe tucked away on a side street, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. She couldn't risk using the hotel Wi-Fi, not for this. Her hands trembled as she paid for an hour of computer time, the anonymity of the bustling cafe offering a sliver of comfort. She created a new, untraceable email address, a jumble of random letters and numbers. Then, navigating to the Metropolitan Police website, she found the section for reporting information on cold cases. The Sarah Wells case was listed, a brief summary alongside a digitally aged photograph that made Olivia's stomach clench. She began to type, her message deliberately vague. I believe I may have seen someone who bears a strong resemblance to the age-progressed images of Sarah Wells. This was in central London recently. I'm not comfortable providing my details at this time, but felt I had to report this. She attached a cropped, slightly blurred image of the original poster photo she had taken, carefully excluding any identifying background markers or herself. She hit send, her heart hammering against her ribs. For the next 45 minutes, she compulsively refreshed her new inbox, but no reply came. The logical part of her brain, the psychology student, knew that police departments likely received hundreds of such tips, that investigations took time. But the desperate young woman, the potential Sarah Wells, craved immediate reassurance, some sign that her tentative reach into the void had been acknowledged. The silence from the system felt like a cold dismissal. Her time in the internet cafe running out, Olivia felt a surge of frustration. This anonymous, digital plea felt inadequate, almost cowardly. She needed something more, some human interaction, even if it had to be cautious. She remembered seeing a small police station near their hotel. Perhaps a direct, albeit still guarded, inquiry might yield something. Back on the streets, the anonymity of the crowds no longer felt comforting but isolating. Each passerby was a reminder of a life she might have had, a world she didn't belong to. She found the police station, a modest brick building that seemed more suited to minor local disputes than earth-shattering revelations of decades-old kidnappings. Taking a deep breath, she walked in. The front desk was manned by a uniformed officer who looked more bored than imposing. He was young, barely older than her, and was engrossed in a form. When Olivia approached, he looked up, his expression neutral. "Can I help you, miss?" Olivia's carefully rehearsed words deserted her. I was wondering if I could get some information about an old missing person case. From 2005, a girl named Sarah Wells. She tried to keep her voice steady, casual, as if it were a matter of academic curiosity. The officer frowned slightly, tapping on his computer keyboard. Sarah Wells, 2005. That's a very old case. Are you a relative? No, Olivia said quickly, perhaps too quickly. No, I'm a psychology student. I'm researching cold cases, the long-term impact on families. I came across this one. It was a flimsy pretext, and she knew it. The officer's eyes scanned her face, a flicker of something, suspicion, or just procedural assessment, in his gaze. All publicly available information on such cases is usually online, miss. We can't disclose sensitive case details to the public, especially for research purposes without official authorization. He gestured vaguely. Data protection, you understand. Right, of course, Olivia stammered. I just thought perhaps there were general updates, or if the case was still considered active. He typed again, then shook his head. It's an open case, technically, as all unsolved missing person cases are. But active leads? After this long, it's unlikely, unless significant new evidence comes to light. He looked at her pointedly. Do you have any new evidence? Her heart leaped. This was her chance, but the words caught in her throat. To articulate her suspicion, to say, I think I might be her, felt like leaping off a cliff. What if they didn't believe her? What if they alerted George? The fear was paralyzing. No, she whispered, the single word a betrayal of the turmoil inside her. No, no new evidence, just academic interest. The officer gave a curt nod. Then I'm afraid I can't help you further. You can check the official police appeals website. Thank you. It was a clear dismissal. He returned to his paperwork, the brief interaction already seemingly forgotten. Olivia stumbled out of the police station, tears stinging her eyes. It wasn't just indifference. It was the impenetrable wall of bureaucracy, the system designed to process, to categorize, but not necessarily to understand or to see the desperate human story behind a tentative inquiry. The still missing poster represented a profound societal injustice, a child stolen, a family broken, and the system's response, at least to her hesitant probing, felt muddled, slow, almost disinterested. She felt utterly alone, caught between a past she didn't know and a present that was rapidly becoming unbearable. The police weren't going to ride in like saviors. If the truth about Sarah Wells, about her, was to be uncovered, the system wouldn't be leading the charge. It would be up to her, a terrifying and isolating realization. The perceived apathy of the system didn't diminish her need for answers. It amplified her desperation. Later that evening, the automated reply finally arrived in her anonymous inbox. It was a standard, impersonal message. Thank you for your information. The Metropolitan Police Service takes all reports seriously. Your submission, Ref MP 785,920B, has been noted. If further details are required, or if this information leads to a direct line of inquiry, we may attempt to contact you if means are provided. Due to the volume of correspondence, we cannot reply to every submission individually. Noted. Not investigated. Not prioritized. Just noted. Olivia closed her laptop, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. The system had responded, but its voice was hollow, its reach intangible. The path to the truth was darker and more solitary than she could have ever imagined. The impersonal, automated police response was a cold splash of reality, extinguishing any lingering hope Olivia had for a swift, external resolution. The system wasn't going to save her. It had merely noted her existence, her potential link to a 17-year-old tragedy. The weight of uncovering the truth now rested squarely on her own young shoulders, a burden that felt heavier with each passing hour. The remaining days of their London trip stretched before her, no longer a joyful exploration but a tense, suffocating charade. Every interaction with George was now a performance, her smiles strained, her laughter hollow. She watched him constantly, searching for cracks in his loving facade, for any telltale sign that he was the monster her burgeoning fears painted him to be. It was during their visit to the Museum of London, ironically a place dedicated to chronicling the city's layered history, that the first true tremor from her buried past occurred. They were in a section detailing post-war childhood, filled with vintage toys and reconstructed rooms. George, seemingly oblivious to her inner turmoil, pointed to a display of faded, well-loved teddy bears. "You had one just like that yellow one, Liv," he said, a nostalgic smile playing on his lips. "Carried it everywhere until its fur was rubbed bare. We called him Sonny." Olivia nodded, a vague recollection of a yellow bear surfacing. Yes, Sonny, a comfort object from her early years. But as she stared at the bear in the glass case, a slightly different shade of yellow, with button eyes instead of the stitched ones, she vaguely remembered. Another image, sharper and more vivid, flashed through her mind. It wasn't Sonny. It was a different bear, a deep blue one, with a missing button eye and a stitched-on red patch on its paw. The image was fleeting, no more than a second, but it was accompanied by a phantom sensation, the rough texture of coarse fur under her small fingers, the faint, sweet smell of what might have been biscuits. She blinked, disoriented. Where had that come from? She had no memory of a blue bear. Her childhood, as narrated by George, was filled with Sonny, with dolls whose names she could still recall, with brightly colored building blocks. This blue bear was an intruder, an unwelcome figment. "You okay, love?" George's voice cut through her confusion. He was looking at her, his brow furrowed with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Fine, Dad," she mumbled, turning away from the display, her heart beating a little too fast. "Just a bit stuffy in here. But the blue bear lingered at the edges of her consciousness. Later that day, as they walked along the South Bank, the cheerful cacophony of street performers and tourists did little to dispel her unease. A street vendor was selling brightly colored pinwheels, their plastic vanes spinning merrily in the breeze. Olivia found herself transfixed by a particular one, a vibrant mix of red and yellow. Suddenly, another flash. A small hand, her hand, reaching for a similar pinwheel, but this one was green and silver. There was laughter, a woman's laughter, light and airy, and the distinct, slightly salty smell of the seaside. Olivia stopped dead in her tracks, the bustling walkway seeming to recede. The seaside? She had no memories of going to the seaside as a very young child. George had always said she was prone to ear infections and that he'd avoided taking her to windy beaches. Their holidays had been to tranquil lakes or quiet countryside spots. This memory, if that's what it was, felt alien, yet intensely familiar. The woman's laughter. It wasn't a voice she recognized, certainly not one she associated with any of George's brief descriptions of Eleanor. These were not just fleeting thoughts. They were sensory experiences, fragments of a life she didn't know she'd lived. They were disorienting, unsettling, and terrifyingly potent. Was her mind playing tricks on her? Or were these genuine cracks appearing in the carefully constructed dam of her supposed past, allowing forgotten truths to seep through? The following evening, George decided to cook dinner in their small hotel kitchenette, a gesture meant to be comforting, a taste of home. He was humming as he chopped vegetables, the picture of domestic normalcy. Olivia watched him, a knot tightening in her stomach. He started talking about her 4th birthday party, a story he'd recounted many times, the bouncy castle in their small backyard, the chocolate cake, the little friends from nursery school. "You were so delighted with that little red tricycle I got you," he said, smiling at the memory. "Rode it around the garden for hours, even though your legs could barely reach the pedals." Olivia nodded, the image of a red tricycle familiar from photographs. But as he spoke, a different memory surfaced, unbidden. A tricycle, yes, but it wasn't red. It was a faded blue, with a distinctive squeak in the left pedal. And it wasn't a garden. It was a paved area, smaller, with a distinctive crack in the concrete shaped vaguely like a leaping frog. There was a sound, too, a dog barking, a small, yappy bark. They'd never owned a dog. "Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper, Did we ever live anywhere else? Before the house on Maple Street?" George paused in his chopping, his back to her. For a moment he didn't answer. The silence stretched, amplifying the rhythmic tick of the kitchen clock. Then he turned, a slightly puzzled expression on his face. "No, Liv. Always Maple Street. Since just before you were born. Why do you ask?" His gaze was steady, his tone even. But Olivia detected something, a fractional hesitation before he spoke, a carefulness in his response that hadn't been there before. Or was she just imagining it, her mind now primed to find suspicion in every nuance? "No reason," she said, looking away. "Just a weird dream I had, I think. The blue bear, the green and silver pinwheel, the woman's laughter, the seaside, the blue tricycle with the squeaky pedal. These weren't dreams. They felt like splinters of another existence, working their way to the surface of her skin. Each fragment was a tiny pinprick of light in the overwhelming darkness of her unknown past, hinting at a life stolen, a narrative erased. That night, sleep was even more elusive. She lay in the dark, the fragmented images replaying in her mind. She tried to piece them together, to find a coherent thread, but they remained stubbornly disconnected, tantalizing glimpses of a world she couldn't quite grasp. The fear was no longer just about George's potential deception. It was about the loss of her own mind, the terrifying possibility that these weren't memories but a stress-induced psychosis. Then, just as dawn was beginning to paint the London sky in hues of grey and pink, another memory fragment broke through, clearer and more disturbing than the others. She was small, very small, and she was crying. There was a hand, a large male hand, clamped gently but firmly over her mouth, not painfully, but enough to stifle her sobs. She could smell a faint, unfamiliar scent, something like old paper and a type of sweet pipe tobacco George never smoked. And she heard a voice, a man's voice, not George's, murmuring, "Hush now, little one. It's all right. We're going on an adventure." The word adventure echoed in the silence of the hotel room, chilling Olivia to the bone. This wasn't a comforting memory. This felt like the beginning of the end of Sarah Wells, and the beginning of Olivia Carter. The image of the hand, the scent, the voice, they were more solid, more insistent than the other fragments. This was not a dream. This was a memory, struggling to be heard. And it told a story far more sinister than a simple, loving father trying to protect his daughter from a painful past. It whispered of abduction. The memory of the man's hand and the whispered word, adventure, became an obsessive echo in Olivia's mind, drowning out the tourist chatter and the city's vibrant pulse. It was no longer a question of if George had lied, but why, and to what horrifying extent. The blue bear, the seaside, the woman's laughter, these were not figments. They were her stolen past clawing its way back. London, once a city of exciting possibilities, now felt like a gilded cage, shared with the man who was both her beloved father and her potential captor. Their scheduled flight back to New York was in 2 days, and the thought of returning to the manufactured reality of Maple Street, to the life built on an unimaginable lie, filled her with a cold dread. She had to find something more, something tangible, before they left. The opportunity, or rather the desperate necessity, presented itself on their penultimate evening. George, unusually restless, announced he was going for a short walk to clear his head, mumbling something about needing to pick up a last-minute souvenir he'd forgotten. His edginess hadn't gone unnoticed by Olivia. Her subtle, probing questions about their past, her quiet withdrawal, had perhaps unsettled him more than she realized. The moment the hotel room door clicked shut behind him, Olivia sprang into action, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She went straight for his suitcase, the large, sturdy one he'd had for years. Her hands were shaking so violently she fumbled with the latches. He was a creature of habit, meticulous in his packing. If there was anything to find, it would be hidden with care, not carelessly tossed in. She sifted through neatly folded clothes, toiletries, and the few books he'd brought. Nothing. Her hope, already a fragile thing, began to wane. Was she wrong? Was this all a hideous, stress-induced delusion? Then, tucked deep in a side pocket, almost an afterthought, she felt it. A soft cloth drawstring bag, the kind used for shoes or delicate items. It was old, the fabric worn thin in places. It felt heavier than it should for an empty shoe bag. With trembling fingers, she pulled it out. The drawstring was knotted tightly. It took her several agonizing seconds to undo it. Her breath held tight in her chest. She tipped the contents onto the hotel bedspread and gasped. There, lying on the patterned fabric, was the blue bear. It was exactly as the fleeting memory had shown her, a deep, sapphire blue, its fur matted and worn with age and, undoubtedly, much handling. One of its button eyes was missing, leaving a small, dark hole. And on its left paw, just as she'd envisioned, was a clumsily stitched red patch, the thread a slightly different shade, as if repaired by an unpracticed hand. It was undeniably her bear, the one from the intrusive, vivid flashback. Not Sunny, the cheerful yellow bear of George's narrative, but this solemn, one-eyed creature that resonated with a far deeper, more primal part of her. A wave of nausea hit her so powerfully she had to grip the edge of the bed. It was real. The memory was real. This bear was the tangible proof, a silent, fluffy witness to a past that had been systematically erased. George had kept it. For 17 years, he had kept this undeniable link to her true identity, to the life he had stolen from her. Why? As a trophy? A reminder? Or some twisted form of sentimentality? Tears streamed down Olivia's face, hot and furious. The grief was overwhelming, for the little girl she had been, for the parents she had never known, and for the father she had loved, who was now unequivocally revealed as the architect of her lifelong deception. But there was more in the bag. Beneath the bear lay a small tin box, no bigger than a matchbox, its surface tarnished with age. Her fingers, slick with sweat, struggled to pry it open. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded cotton wool, was not a child's drawing or a news clipping. It was a photograph, a tiny wallet-sized portrait, creased and softened at the edges. It showed a smiling young couple, their faces radiant with joy. The woman had dark, curly hair and wide, intelligent eyes that Olivia now saw reflected in her own mirror every day. The man beside her had a kind, open face, his arm protectively around her shoulder, and cradled in the woman's arms, wrapped in a soft yellow blanket, was a baby with a shock of dark hair and a serious, unblinking gaze. Olivia's gaze. On the back of the photograph, written in faded blue ink in a neat, looping hand, were the words, "Mark, Susan, and our darling Sarah, 3 months old, April 2001. Sarah, her name. Mark and Susan Wells, her parents. The world tilted. The air rushed from Olivia's lungs as if she'd been punched. This wasn't just evidence. This was her genesis, her stolen legacy, held captive in a small tin box by the man she called father. He hadn't just taken a child. He had known her parents, had possessed their image, their joy, and kept it hidden. The sheer calculated cruelty of it was staggering. This photo wasn't a vague link. It was a direct, undeniable bullseye, a confirmation so absolute it left no room for doubt, no space for any other interpretation. The sound of a keycard in the hotel room door sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Olivia. George was back. She scrambled, her mind a blank canvas of panic. She shoved the blue bear and the tin box back into the cloth bag, her movements clumsy and jerky. There was no time to hide it properly, no time to think. She thrust the bag under her own pillow just as George stepped into the room, a small, brightly colored carrier bag from a souvenir shop in his hand. "Just managed to find that shortbread Granny Smith likes," he said, his voice attempting a lightness that sounded jarringly false to Olivia's ears. He stopped, his gaze falling on her tear-streaked face, her wild eyes. "Liv, what on earth is wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." The same words he'd uttered by Big Ben, but this time the irony was a venomous serpent. Olivia stared at him, the man who was a stranger, a kidnapper, the keeper of her stolen life. The photograph of Mark and Susan Wells, their happy faces, burned in her mind. The soft, worn fur of the blue bear felt like a brand on her fingertips. The situation had irrevocably reversed. She was no longer the confused, doubting daughter. She was Sarah Wells, and she held the undeniable, heartbreaking proof of her abduction. The power, a terrifying and sorrowful power, had shifted. The question was no longer what had happened, but what she, Sarah, was going to do about it. The adventure was over. The reckoning was about to begin. George Carter's question. "Liv, what on earth is wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost," hung suspended in the stale air of the hotel room, a fragile query poised before an avalanche of truth. Sarah, for she would never again answer to Olivia in the silent chambers of her own mind, met his gaze. The man before her, the architect of her stolen years, seemed to shrink under her unwavering stare. The carefully constructed persona of the loving, slightly bumbling father was fracturing, revealing the terrified, cornered individual beneath. The tears that had streamed down her face moments before had dried, leaving behind a chilling residue of resolve. Under her pillow, the cloth bag containing the blue bear and the irrefutable photograph of her infancy with Mark and Susan Wells felt like a lodestone, pulling her towards an inevitable, painful confrontation. "I know who Sarah Wells is, Dad," she stated, her voice a low, steady current in the sudden, oppressive silence. The dad was a reflex, a ghost of an old affection, but it carried no warmth, only the weight of profound betrayal. The souvenir bag, filled with shortbread for a non-existent Granny Smith, slipped from George's grasp, landing with a muffled thud on the worn carpet. His face, moments before etched with a forced casualness, contorted, aging a decade in a single, horrifying second. It was a mask of pure, unadulterated terror, the kind she had seen on victims in psychological case studies, the kind she now recognized as the mirror image of her own recent torment. He made a choking sound, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish, words failing him in the face of her terrible knowledge. "Don't," Sarah commanded, her voice cutting through his nascent attempt at denial. The steel in her tone surprised even herself. It was the voice of Sarah Wells, a girl denied her name, her family, her very history, but a girl who was now, finally, finding her strength. She slowly, deliberately, drew the cloth bag from beneath her pillow. The weight of its contents, the one-eyed blue bear, a silent sentinel of her lost childhood, and the small tin box holding the photograph of Mark and Susan Wells, their faces beaming with a joy he had extinguished, was an anchor in the storm of her emotions. "You kept him. You kept them," she repeated, the accusation hanging heavy and undeniable between them. George collapsed onto the edge of his bed, as if his legs could no longer support the weight of his deception. His shoulders, usually so broad and comforting, now sagged, embodying the collapse of his 17-year lie. He was a stranger, stripped of his disguise, revealed as a thief of lives. "Olivia, live, please," he pleaded, his voice a ragged whisper, clinging to the name he had given her, the identity he had manufactured. "My name," she stated, each word a chisel chipping away at the false edifice of their life, "is Sarah Wells. And Mark and Susan Wells, the people in that photograph you've hidden from me for 17 years, they are my parents, aren't they?" He couldn't meet her eyes. His gaze dropped to his trembling hands, clasped tightly in his lap as if to stop them from flying apart. The silence in the room was a roaring confession, louder and more damning than any verbal admission could ever be. It was the silence of guilt, profound and absolute. Why? The question was torn from Sarah's throat, a raw, ragged sound that encapsulated a lifetime of stolen moments, erased memories, and a grief so deep it felt as though it might cleave her in two. "Why would you do this to them? Why would you do this to me?" When George finally lifted his head, his eyes were swimming in tears, not the gentle, sorrowful tears he'd shed for the fictional Eleanor, but the desperate, scalding tears of a man whose soul was being laid bare. I never meant... It wasn't supposed to be like this," he stammered, his voice hoarse with unshed grief and fear. "It was more complicated than that." "Complicated?" Sarah's laugh was a brittle, humorless sound. "You kidnapped a child, George. You stole her from her family. You built my entire life on a monstrous lie. There's nothing complicated about that. It's an act of pure, calculated cruelty." He began to speak then, the words tumbling out in a torrent of long-suppressed guilt and twisted justification. He spoke of Susan Wells, Sarah's mother, of an unrequited love from his youth, a fixation that had festered over years. He claimed he had seen Susan with young Sarah in a London park, perceived unhappiness in Susan's eyes, a figment of his own deluded imagination, and convinced himself he was performing a rescue, saving Sarah from a life he deemed less worthy, less loving than the one he could provide. The adventure he had whispered about to a terrified 4-year-old girl, as he covered her mouth and spirited her away, was his own grotesque fantasy. He'd seen a fleeting opportunity when Sarah had momentarily wandered from her mother's side, a lapse of a few seconds that had catastrophically altered the trajectory of 3 lives. He hadn't planned it, he insisted, not in the long term, but the initial impulsive act had set him on a path from which he felt he could never deviate. Each lie had necessitated another, burying him deeper, making the truth an ever more terrifying prospect. The yellow bear, Sunny, had been a desperate attempt to superimpose a happier, fabricated memory over the persistent, undeniable image of the blue bear, the silent witness he couldn't bring himself to destroy. Sarah listened, a cold numbness spreading through her. His words were a pathetic, self-serving litany, offering no comfort, no understanding, only the stark portrait of a profoundly selfish man who had elevated his own distorted desires above the sacred bond of parent and child, above the unimaginable, enduring agony of Mark and Susan Wells. When his wretched confession finally petered out, the silence that fell was heavier than before, filled with the ghosts of what might have been. Sarah rose, the cloth bag a tangible symbol of her reclaimed identity. "I found the news reports," she said, her voice devoid of inflection. "Online. My parents. Mark and Susan. They never gave up looking for me. 17 years and they never stopped." George winced as if she had physically struck him. "I know," he whispered, the admission a fresh stab of betrayal. "I saw the appeals. Over the years. The anniversary articles. Oh." That he had known of their unceasing torment, witnessed their public grief, and remained silent, was an act of cruelty so profound it defied comprehension. Sarah walked to the hotel telephone, her movements precise, her resolve absolute. "I'm calling the police, George." Her voice was calm. "And then, I'm going to find my parents, my real parents." He made no move to stop her. He simply sat, a broken figure, his face buried in his hands, the only sound in the room the quiet, desperate gasps of his own desolate weeping. The call to the Metropolitan Police was brief, her voice surprisingly steady as she identified herself, Sarah Wells, and reported that she was with the man who had abducted her in July 2005. The operator, after a moment of stunned silence, responded with swift professionalism, assuring her that officers were en route. The intervening minutes stretched into an eternity. Sarah couldn't bear to look at George. She stood by the window, her gaze fixed on the sprawling, indifferent lights of London, a city that had unwittingly conspired to both hide and reveal her. The blue bear and the tin box now lay on the bedside table, their silent vigil over, their secrets exposed. The arrival of the uniformed officers was both a relief and a further trauma. They were calm, efficient, their presence transforming the hotel room into a crime scene. George offered no protest, no resistance. He was a man hollowed out, his face ashen, his eyes reflecting a deep, unplumbable despair. As they escorted him from the room, he paused at the threshold, his gaze finding Sarah's. "I did love you, Liv." "Sarah," he choked out, the words a desperate, final plea. "In my own twisted, broken way, I truly did." Sarah offered no reply. His love, if it could even be called that, had been a cage, gilded with affection but built on theft and lies. The hours that followed were a maelstrom of procedural necessities. Statements given, questions answered, the sympathetic yet firm presence of detectives who specialized in such unimaginable cases. The police machinery was now in full motion. Contact had been made with the authorities in the area where Mark and Susan Wells currently resided. They had, understandably, moved away from London years prior, seeking solace from the constant, painful reminders of their loss. The news of Sarah's discovery was being broken to them, gently, with the utmost care. A reunion, tentative and unimaginably fraught, was being arranged. As the first pale light of dawn crept over the London skyline, Sarah found herself in a quiet, sterile room at the police station. A cup of tea, untouched, grew cold on the table beside her. She felt simultaneously empty and overflowing, exhausted beyond measure, yet vibrating with a fragile, almost terrifying anticipation. She was Sarah Wells. She had parents. She had a past, a true history that had been stolen but was now, incredibly, within her grasp. The road ahead would be a labyrinth of emotional complexities. There would be no easy mending, no swift return to a life that had been so violently interrupted. Forging a relationship with Mark and Susan, processing 17 years of absence, of unknowing, and navigating the legal repercussions for George, it would be a monumental undertaking. A simple happily ever after was a fairy tale that had no place in this stark reality. But as she clutched the worn photograph of her infant self, nestled between her smiling, youthful parents, a seed of hope, tenacious and resilient, began to sprout in the barren landscape of her grief. The truth, in all its devastating clarity, had been revealed. And in that revelation, however painful, lay the first, faltering step towards reclaiming a name, a family, and a life that had waited, against all odds, for her return. The false adventure George had engineered was over. A new, true, and terrifyingly uncertain journey was only just beginning.